On Christmas morning in 1861, as church bells rang and homes across the South exchanged gifts wrapped in silk and ribbon, a plantation mistress unwrapped a present that no one dared question. Inside the grand house, beneath the polite smiles and whispered prayers, stood a small enslaved boy, silent, barefoot, and marked as property. He was given to her the way one might give a horse or a silver tray, a living gift, a child. But this Christmas offering carried a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. The boy's eyes reflected something disturbingly familiar. His face bore the same features as the woman now called his owner. The same blood ran through their veins. The same lineage bound them together. This enslaved child was not a stranger taken from another plantation. He was her own son, born in secrecy, buried under law and erased by a system that turned motherhood into ownership. In 1861, as the nation fractured on the brink of civil war, slavery demanded more than labor. It demanded silence. It demanded lies. And on that Christmas morning, one woman accepted a gift that exposed the cruelest contradiction of American slavery. A mother could own her child and society would call it normal. This is the story of a Christmas gift that was never meant to be opened and a truth America tried to keep wrapped forever. Christmas morning in 1861 arrived quietly on the plantation, wrapped not in peace but in uneasy stillness. The Civil War had been burning for months, yet inside the great house the rituals of wealth and tradition continued as if repetition alone could protect them from collapse. Dawn crept through tall windows, pale winter light spilling across polished wooden floors that had been scrubbed the night before by hands that would never touch a gift of their own. Outside, frost clung to bare branches and hardened the soil, while inside fires crackled in hearths built by enslaved labor, warming rooms that smelled of pine, candle wax, and rice bread. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Garlands of evergreen were draped along the staircase, their sharp scent mixing with the sweetness of dried oranges and cloves. A Christmas tree stood in the parlor, its branches trimmed with ribbons, handmade ornaments and small tokens imported from Europe. Symbols of refinement meant to declare that culture and gentility still lived here, even as the world beyond the gates fractured. Beneath the tree, wrapped parcels waited, each carefully labeled in looping script, each carrying expectations, power, or obligation. Servants moved silently through the halls before the family rose. Their footsteps were measured, cautious, learned through years of discipline. They knew Christmas meant longer hours, stricter observation, and the constant performance of cheerfulness. A smile had to be convincing, gratitude visible even when it was forced. For the enslaved, this day was a contradiction, a celebration of birth and salvation layered over a system that denied their own humanity. Some had been allowed to attend midnight prayers in the slave quarters. Others whispered hymns under their breath as they worked, holding on to fragments of hope passed down through generations. In the mistress's bedchamber, heavy curtains were drawn back to let in the morning light. She rose slowly, aware of the significance of the day, her movements deliberate, her posture composed. Christmas demanded grace. It demanded a display of moral order. She dressed carefully, choosing fabrics that spoke of status and restraint, smoothing her hair as she studied her reflection, already preparing the expression she would wear before others. Downstairs, her husband's boots echoed briefly as he crossed the hall, the sound firm, authoritative, a reminder that this house, like the land itself, rested on ownership. The plantation was unusually quiet for a working morning. Field labor was suspended, at least in name, and that alone created a strange sense of suspension, as if time itself had slowed. Enslaved children lingered near doorways, hoping for small treats, while elders watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. They had seen many Christmases come and go, each one promising mercy and delivering little more than performance. A piece of meat, an extra blanket, a half-day's rest, these were called gifts, though they were merely temporary relaxations of cruelty. As the family gathered in the parlor, the firelight cast long shadows against the walls, stretching figures into shapes that seemed larger than life. Chairs were arranged just so. A silver tray held cups of warm cider. The mood was carefully controlled, a balance between reverence and indulgence. Outside, the sound of a distant bell drifted across the fields, carried by cold air, reminding everyone that somewhere beyond the plantation, people spoke of peace and goodwill, even as soldiers marched and bled. The mistress took her seat near the tree, hands folded in her lap. She was accustomed to receiving gifts, accustomed to being pleased. Jewelry, letters, perhaps a new book, all expected, all acceptable. What she did not expect was the way the morning seemed staged, as if something larger than ribbons and paper hovered just beyond sight. Her husband's eyes lingered on her longer than usual. The overseer stood closer to the doorway than he typically would on such a day. Servants paused, then moved again, their faces carefully blank. The plantation house, built to project permanence, carried the weight of generations. Its walls had witnessed births, deaths, celebrations, punishments, and transactions that were never spoken of in polite company. On this Christmas morning, that history pressed closer, filling the rooms with an unspoken tension. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, every cough more noticeable. Even the fire cracked sharply, sending sparks upward as if protesting the calm imposed upon it. Beyond the parlor windows, the yard lay open and exposed. Frost glittered on the grass. Smoke rose from chimneys near the quarters, thin and pale against the winter sky. Enslaved families stood together, waiting, knowing they might be summoned, knowing that Christmas often brought public displays meant to reinforce hierarchy. A gift exchange in the big house was never private. It rippled outward, affecting everyone who lived within the plantation's reach. The mistress smiled when prompted, nodding politely as small parcels were presented. Each gift was opened with practiced appreciation, her reactions measured, her words carefully chose. Gratitude flowed upward, never outward. Servants watched closely, ready to respond to any command, any gesture. The room felt crowded despite the space, filled with expectation that did not belong to celebration alone. In 1861, Christmas carried an added weight. War rumors drifted even into places that pretended to be untouched. Sons and brothers had gone to fight. Letters arrived sporadically, sometimes stained, sometimes delayed, sometimes never arriving at all. The plantation relied on the illusion that its world could remain unchanged, that tradition could outlast gunfire and politics. This morning was part of that illusion, an insistence that order still ruled here. Yet beneath the polished surface, the plantation was a place of constant negotiation, between fear and authority, desire and denial, truth and silence. Christmas morning amplified these tensions. It brought everyone into closer proximity, forced interactions that could not be avoided. Eyes met and quickly looked away. Thoughts remained unspoken but heavy. As the fire burned lower and the light shifted through the windows, the house itself seemed to lean inward, drawing its inhabitants into a single moment. A moment carefully constructed, carefully controlled, where appearances mattered more than reality, where the language of faith and family masked a system built on possession, where a celebration meant to honor birth and love unfolded inside walls that denied both to so many. And within that plantation house, on that cold Christmas morning in 1861, as the rituals continued and the world beyond edged closer to chaos, something waited just beyond the wrapping paper, something rooted not in tradition but in blood, something that would pass from hand to hand under the name of a gift. Standing quietly as the room prepared itself for what was about to be revealed, the enslaved boy was brought forward not with ceremony, but with the careful precision reserved for objects of value. He did not enter the room on his own. A hand rested lightly on his shoulder, guiding him across the threshold of the parlor where the fire burned and the Christmas tree stood adorned with symbols of abundance. His feet were bare against the polished floor, his clothes clean but plain, chosen to mark him as presentable without granting dignity. He stood small beneath the high ceiling, dwarfed by furniture designed to impress, by portraits of ancestors who stared down from the walls as if to bear witness. No announcement was made at first. The boy was positioned near the tree, just far enough from the servants to be separate, just close enough to the family to be claimed. The room quieted in a way that was different from reverence. This was not the hush of prayer but the pause that precedes ownership being declared. The mistress looked up, her expression prepared for gratitude, her smile ready for display. Her eyes settled on the child, taking him in as one would assess livestock, noting posture, health, useful. "He is yours," her husband said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of law and custom. The words were simple, stripped of emotion, framed as generosity, a gift. The boy did not look at the man who spoke. His gaze remained fixed ahead, trained by years of instruction to avoid eye contact unless commanded. He had been told to stand still. He stood very still. The idea of giving a human being as a Christmas present was not spoken of as cruelty within these walls. It was spoken of as privilege. Enslaved bodies were currency, inheritance, reward. On this plantation, births were counted not as blessings, but as increases. Children were listed alongside tools and animals in records kept with neat handwriting and no hesitation. To present a child on Christmas morning was to demonstrate wealth, control, and the reach of one's authority. The mistress rose from her chair slowly, the silk of her dress whispering as she moved. She circled the boy once, her steps measured, her face composed. She observed his hands, his shoulders, the set of his jaw. He was old enough to be useful, young enough to be molded. A good age. She nodded faintly, The gesture subtle but sufficient. Approval did not require words. Servants watched from the edges of the room, their expressions carefully neutral. They understood the meaning of this moment more clearly than anyone else present. To them the boy was not an abstract gift, but a life about to be redirected, a future narrowed. Some recognized. Whispers moved silently through their minds as memories surfaced, seeing him near the quarters, knowing whose cabin he had slept in, remembering a woman who no longer appeared at gatherings. The boy felt the weight of attention without fully understanding its purpose. He had been washed that morning, his hair smoothed, his body scrubbed until his skin tingled. He had been told to behave, to be quiet, to do exactly as instructed. Fear pressed against his ribs, steady and familiar. He had learned that silence could be survival. He did not know what Christmas meant to the people in this room, only that it had brought him here. The mistress placed a hand under his chin, and lifted his face slightly, just enough to see his eyes. The contact was brief, almost gentle, but it carried ownership within. She smiled then, a small smile, one meant to signal satisfaction. "He will do," she said, as though confirming the quality of fabric or the condition of a horse. Her husband inclined his head. The transaction was complete. No paper was signed, no price was discussed. The law had already done that work for them. The boy belonged to her now in a way that was absolute, reinforced by custom, church and state. Christmas sanctified the exchange, wrapping it in the language of generosity and blessing. A servant stepped forward to place a small ribbon in the boy's hands, red against his dark skin. It was meant to mark the occasion, to visually complete the fiction that this was a gift like any other. The boy held it awkwardly, unsure what to do. Laughter rippled lightly through the room, not unkind, but detached, amusement at his uncertainty, at the novelty of the moment. Outside the parlor, life on the plantation continued in fragments. In the quarters, news spread quickly, carried through glances and murmurs. A child had been given. The words were familiar, heavy with meaning. Mothers pulled their own children closer, even though they knew closeness offered no protection. Fathers stared at the ground, their jaws tight. Elders exchanged looks that spoke of loss they had seen too many times before. Back inside, the boy was instructed to step closer to the mistress. He obeyed. She placed her hand on his shoulder, possessive now, claiming, "You will attend me," she said. "You will learn quickly." Her tone was not cruel. It did not need to be. Cruelty was built into the structure that allowed her to speak this way. The boy nodded, though he did not fully grasp what was being asked of him. Attend meant serve. Serve meant obedience. Obedience meant survival. These were lessons learned early, passed down not through books but through pain and observation. He understood enough to know that his life had shifted, that whatever small routines he had known before were gone. The Christmas tree glittered beside them, candles reflecting in glass ornament. The contrast was stark, though no one in the room named it. A child stood as property while symbols of faith and celebration framed the scene. The language of birth and salvation hung in the air, unexamined, while a living person was reduced to possession. The mistress returned to her seat, drawing the boy with her. He stood at her side now, close enough to feel the warmth of her skirt, close enough to be seen as an extension of her presence. Another gift was brought forward, another smile offered, but the atmosphere had shifted. Something irreversible had occurred, even if it was treated as routine. The boy's eyes moved briefly across the room, searching instinctively for a familiar face. He found none that could meet his gaze. The servants looked away, not out of indifference but out of necessity. To acknowledge him openly would be to acknowledge the violence of what had just taken place, and that was not permitted in this space. Christmas prayers would be said later, thanks would be given, the family would speak of blessings and providence. The boy would be assigned a place to sleep, tasks to learn, rules to follow. His name might be changed or shortened, reshaped to fit the household's comfort. His past would be treated as irrelevant, his future as something to be decided by others. In the parlor, the fire continued to burn steadily. The ribbon slipped from the boy's hands and fell to the floor, unnoticed, resting there like a dropped fragment of the lie everyone had agreed to believe. The mistress did not hesitate once the boy was placed beside her. Acceptance came as naturally as breath, shaped by years of living within a system that taught her ownership was not cruelty but order. She rested her hand on the arm of her chair, fingers relaxed, posture composed as if a child standing at her side were no more remarkable than a new piece of furniture. To accept him was to affirm the world as she understood it, a world where her comfort and authority were unquestioned, where the law itself bent to protect her position. Her face revealed Divraband unexpected. There was no shock, No visible discomfort, no hesitation that might suggest death. If anything stirred beneath the surface, it was carefully sealed away, buried beneath layers of training and belief. She had been raised to understand that enslaved people were assets, that their lives existed in relation to her needs, her household, her lineage. The boy's presence did not challenge that understanding, it confirmed it. She acknowledged her husband with a glance, a subtle exchange that required no words. This was a gesture of agreement, of unity. He had given her something of value, something that reinforced her status within the household. In accepting the boy, she accepted not only the gift, but the intention behind it. She would be seen as a woman of means, a woman whose household required additional service, whose authority extended over another life. Her voice when she spoke was calm and measured. She asked his name, not because she intended to preserve it, but because knowing it was part of the ritual. The boy answered quietly, his voice barely audible. She repeated it once, tasting the sound, then nodded as if deciding how it might be reshaped. Names were flexible here. They could be shortened, replaced, stripped of meaning, molded to fit convenience. Yes, she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. That will do. With that, the acceptance was complete. There was no formal declaration required. The room adjusted around her decision, everyone present recognizing the shift. Servants recalibrated their understanding of hierarchy. The boy now belonged within the inner orbit of the house, closer to her, further from the quarter. His position had changed, and with it, the nature of his vulnerability. She gestured for him to stand straighter, her fingers briefly correcting his posture. The touch was light, almost maternal in appearance, though stripped of warmth. It was instruction, not affection. She was already shaping him into what she required, envisioning where he would stand, what he would carry, how quickly he would learn to anticipate her needs. In her mind, she catalogued tasks. He could be trained to run errands within the house, to assist with dressing, to carry messages, to stand silently when needed. He was young enough to be taught obedience without resistance, old enough to be useful without constant supervision. This pleased her. Efficiency mattered. Order mattered. Around her, the Christmas gathering resumed its rhythm. Conversation picked up. Cups were refilled. Small laughter floated across the room. The boy remained still, aware that movement without permission could draw attention he did not want. He felt the weight of her presence beside him, the invisible boundary that now defined his world. The mistress leaned back slightly, studying the room as if seeing it anew with an included. She imagined how others would observe her in the coming weeks, how they would note the additional servant at her side. There would be nods of approval, quiet acknowledgments of her household standing. No one would question the origin of the boy. Questions were impolite. Silence was the currency of respectability. She accepted congratulations with a small smile, a raised chin. A neighbor remarked that it was a generous gift. Another commented on the boy's strong build. The mistress responded politely, her words careful, neutral. She did not express delight. Excessive emotion would have been unbecoming. Acceptance was dignified, restrained. In accepting the boy, she also accepted responsibility, though not in the way responsibility is often understood. She would feed him, clothe him, ensure he remained healthy enough to work. These obligations were framed as kindness within her world, evidence of benevolence. She believed this sincerely. To her, cruelty was excess, punishment beyond necessity, disorder, ownership, properly managed was seen as care. The boy sensed the shift immediately. Her approval settled over him like a new rule he could not yet decipher. He did not know what acceptance meant in practice, only that resistance was impossible. He listened carefully to the tone of her voice, watching her hands, learning the unspoken signals that governed survival. Every movement she made became instruction. She addressed a servant, giving quiet directions about where the boy would sleep, what he would wear, when he would begin his duties. The servant nodded, eyes lowered, absorbing the commands without comment. The transfer was seamless, efficient. The machinery of the household absorbed the new addition without friction. The mistress did not look at the boy when she issued these orders. She did not need to. His presence was already assumed, already integrated into her plan. She turned her attention back to her guests, her role as hostess resuming effortlessly. If any internal conflict existed, it was buried deep, protected by layers of justification and habit. She had been taught that emotions could be managed, that certain feelings were dangerous if indulged. Attachment to enslaved people was discouraged, framed as weakness. Distance preserved authority. She maintained that distance now,
Even as the boy stood within arm's reach, her acceptance was not intimacy, it was possession. As the morning wore on, she occasionally gestured for him to fetch something, testing his responsiveness. Each time he reacted quickly, eager to please, eager to avoid correction. She noted this with approval. Obedience came easily to him. That too was a quality she valued. Her acceptance extended beyond the parlor. In her mind, she began to adjust routines, imagining how he would fit into the rhythm of her days. She pictured him standing quietly during visits, moving efficiently through hallways, learning the household's unspoken rule. She did not imagine his inner life. That was unnecessary. The Christmas light shifted through the windows, stretching shadows across the floor. The boy's shadow merged briefly with hers, then separated as she moved. The symbolism went unnoticed by everyone in the room. What mattered was that the gift had been received, acknowledged, absorbed. By accepting the boy without question, without visible discomfort, the mistress reinforced the system that made such a moment possible. Her calm became a form of consent, her composure a shield against scrutiny. In that acceptance lay generations of practice, of inherited belief, of willful blindness, passed down like tradition. She sipped her drink, adjusted her gloves, and continued her conversation, the boy standing beside her as though he had always been there, as though his presence required no explanation, no justification, no reckoning. As the day unfolded according to custom, the house settling back into its familiar rhythms, carried.
The resemblance was not something that announced itself loudly. It did not arrive with shock or open recognition. It revealed itself in fragments and angles and expressions that unsettled only when one looked too long. At first it was the eyes, not their color alone, but the way they held focus, the quiet intensity beneath lowered lashes. Several people in the room noticed it without consciously naming it, a brief pause in their thoughts before they moved on, unwilling to linger where discomfort waited. When the boy stood beside the mistress, the similarity grew harder to ignore. The curve of his cheek mirrored hers when he turned slightly toward the fire. The line of his nose, still softened by youth, carried the same shape seen in her portraits hanging along the corridor. Even his mouth, when pressed into silence, echoed the familiar restraint she had perfected over years of social discipline. It was not an exact reflection, but it was close enough to disturb the careful order of things. The mistress herself felt it before she acknowledged it. A flicker of recognition passed through her chest, quick and unwelcome. She did not let it reach her face. She had trained herself too well for that. Instead, she adjusted her posture, lifted her chin, and narrowed her gaze slightly, as though inspecting for flaws rather than connection. If she noticed anything, she did not allow it to become language. Others noticed too. A guest's eyes moved from the boy to the mistress and back again, the motion subtle but deliberate. An overseer shifted his weight, suddenly interested in the pattern of the rug beneath his boot. A servant froze for a fraction of a second before resuming their task, breath caught behind closed lips. Recognition lived in these pauses, in the brief hesitations where truth brushed against awareness. The resemblance did not invite comment, it invited silence. In this world, silence was a practiced skill, an inheritance passed down with land and name. To speak what one saw would have been to fracture the illusion that sustained them all. Better to look away, better to pretend coincidence, better to accept the explanation that would never be spoken aloud. The boy felt the attention even if he did not understand its cause. He sensed eyes on him, measuring, comparing. He shifted slightly, then stilled himself again, unsure whether movement would worsen whatever invisible judgment hovered around him. He had been told before that he looked like someone. He did not know who. He only knew that such comments always came with tension, with quick corrections, with voices lowered afterward. The mistress rose again, moving closer to the boy, as though proximity might reassert control. Standing side by side, the similarity sharpened. Height and age masked some of it, but not all. The alignment of their brows, the familiar tilt of the head when listening, these were things blood remembered even when language denied them. For a moment her hand hovered near his shoulder, then settled there, firm, possessive. If she felt anything beyond ownership, she did not allow it to surface. Emotion in this context was dangerous. To acknowledge resemblance was to invite questions. To invite questions was to risk exposure. Exposure threatened everything: marriage, status, respectability. The system that protected her demanded denial, and she complied instinctively. Her husband noticed as well. His eyes lingered on the boy longer than necessary, his jaw tightening briefly before smoothing again. He had seen the resemblance before this morning. He had arranged things precisely to keep it contained. The gift was not generosity alone, it was management. By placing the boy under her authority within her household, he believed he could control proximity, narrative, outcome. The resemblance was already being rewritten in his mind. He told himself the boy took after someone else, a distant relative, a coincidence amplified by imagination. He had rehearsed these justifications long before Christmas arrived. The law offered him comfort. Society offered him cover. His certainty rested not in truth but in power. Across the room, a woman seated near the window studied the boy with quiet intensity. She had known the mistress since childhood. She had seen her features change over the years, watched her grow into the role she now occupied. The similarities unsettled her, though she would never speak of it. She pressed her lips together, her gaze drifting toward the tree, choosing decoration over revelation. Servants were the most aware, and the most constrained. They lived closest to the truth, close enough to recognize patterns others pretended not to see. They knew which women disappeared from the quarters. They knew which children were reassigned without explanation. They knew the cost of resemblance. For them, the boy's face was not a mystery. It was a confirmation. One servant in particular avoided looking at him altogether. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured cider, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. She remembered holding the boy as an infant, remembered being told never to speak of it. The resemblance had been there even then, faint but undeniable. She swallowed hard and focused on her task, reminding herself that memory was a liability. The boy glanced up once, just briefly, and their eyes met. In that instant, something passed between them. Recognition, sorrow, warning. She looked away first. He did not know why his chest tightened, only that something felt wrong, unfinished, heavy with meaning he could not name. The mistress caught the glance, and felt irritation rise, not at the boy but at the possibility of disruption. She corrected his posture again, sharper this time, her fingers pressing just enough to communicate compensed pleasure. He straightened immediately, gaze dropping to the floor, control restored. Conversation continued, but it skirted around the boy, around the resemblance, around the tension that had crept into the room. Words filled the space where truth threatened to emerge. Laughter sounded a fraction too loud. Compliments were repeated unnecessarily. The performance intensified as though volume alone could drown out observation. The Christmas light shifted again, illuminating the boy's face from a different angle. For a moment, the resemblance softened, receded. Relief passed quietly through the room. People relaxed, unconsciously grateful for the reprieve. Denial regained its footing. But resemblance is patient. It waits. It reappears in movement, in expression, in moments no one can fully control. When the boy frowned slightly in confusion at a command, his face echoed the mistress's own expression of displeasure. When he nodded in understanding, the motion mirrored hers so precisely that it sent another ripple of unease through those paying attention. The mistress turned away, focusing on a conversation near the fireplace. She did not need to see the boy to know he was there. His presence pressed against her awareness, not as a child, but as a reflection she refused to recognize. She had spent her life mastering separation between thought and action, between desire and consequence. This was simply another exercise in discipline. The boy remained silent, absorbing the room's unspoken rule. He sensed that something about him drew attention. He did not want, something he could not change. He resolved, without words, to be smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Survival had taught him that invisibility was often safer than resemblance. Around them, Christmas continued. Candles burned lower. Wrapping paper gathered at the edges of the room. The resemblance lingered, unaddressed but present, woven into glances and pauses, into the careful choreography of denial that allowed everyone to proceed as though nothing extraordinary stood between the mistress and the enslaved boy who looked so much like her, close enough to unsettle, distant enough to remain unspoken. The birth had never been announced. There were no prayers spoken over it in the big house, no visitors summoned, no record entered into the family Bible where names were usually preserved with care. It happened quietly, deliberately kept outside the boundaries of acknowledgement. The world that governed the plantation did not permit such a birth to exist openly, so it was pushed into the shadows where inconvenient truths were trained to survive without language. It began months earlier, long before Christmas, long before the boy was old enough to stand in the parlor. The signs were noticed early by those who lived closest to the rhythms of bodies and labor. A woman in the quarters grew slower in her movements. Tasks were reassigned without explanation. Whispers moved quickly, then stopped just as fast. Everyone understood the danger of knowing too much. Knowledge was not power for them. It was risk. The pregnancy was never named as such in any space that mattered. It was managed.
The woman was moved away from certain duties not out of compassion but discretion. She was watched carefully, instructed quietly, reminded often of silence. Her body became a problem to be solved, not a life carrying another. When pain came, it came behind closed doors, attended by hands that knew how to help without asking questions. The child was born at night, as so many things were on the plantation. Darkness offered cover. The cries were muffled quickly, not through cruelty but necessity. The air was thick with fear and understanding. This was not a birth meant to be celebrated. It was a consequence meant to be concealed. Those present knew immediately what the child represented. It was not simply that he existed, but who he resembled, whose blood marked him in ways that could not be undone. Even in infancy, before features had fully formed, there were signs: the shape of his brow, the set of his mouth, the familiarity that made grown women exchange looks and then look away. Decisions were made swiftly, without the woman's consent being a factor. The child would not be raised in the quarters as others were. That closeness carried risk. Familiarity bred observation. Observation bred question. Instead, arrangements were made to distance the truth without removing it entirely. Distance was safer than disappearance. Erasure invited suspicion. Containment was preferred. The woman was told what would happen, not directly, not with cruelty, but with finality. This was how things were done. She listened without interrupting, her face carefully blank because emotion would have achieved nothing. She had learned that survival often required compliance, that looked like acceptance. When she was told the child would be taken, she did not cry out. She did not resistance would only have invited punishment that would not change the outcome. The child was carried away before dawn, wrapped in cloth that had once belonged to someone else. He was placed where his existence could be explained as something ordinary, something expected. Another enslaved child among many, a new entry in a ledger that did not record fathers, did not record circumstances, did not record truth. As he grew, the secrecy did not loosen, it tightened. Each year that passed increased the risk. Features sharpened, movements began to echo familiar ones. Servants noticed, then trained themselves not to notice. Overseers were instructed, implicitly, to keep certain distances, to redirect attention when needed. The boy was guided through childhood with invisible hands steering him away from places and people that might invite recognition. The mistress never spoke of the birth because to speak of it would have been to admit it. Admission carried consequences. She could not afford. Her position depended on a carefully maintained image of virtue, of order, of control. The existence of the child threatened none of that, as long as it remained unspoken. Silence was not absence, it was strategy. Within the household, stories were shaped subtly over time. If the boy's presence required explanation, one was ready. He had been born elsewhere. His mother had been sold. His father unknown. These explanations were not meant to be convincing in truth, only sufficient in practice. People heard what they were expected to hear. Curiosity was dulled by custom. The woman who had given birth learned to live with the separation as a condition of survival. She saw the boy only at a distance, passing through yards or corridors where she pretended not to look. When she did see him, her face remained neutral, her body disciplined. Love, if it existed, had to be folded inward, hidden so deeply it did not show even in posture. Others in the quarters understood what had happened without needing confirmation. They had seen it before, not always with the same faces, but with the same pattern. Children born of secrecy were always the most carefully controlled. Their lives were shaped not by their needs, but by the fear they inspired in those who owned them. The boy grew up sensing boundaries he did not understand. He was corrected more often, watched more closely, moved more deliberately. There were places he was not allowed to linger, people he was not encouraged to know. He learned these limits instinctively, the way children learn where they are not welcome long before anyone explains why. The secrecy followed him like a shadow. He did not know its origin, only its way. He felt it in the way voices lowered when he approached, in the way conversations stopped and resumed after he passed. He learned early that asking questions brought discomfort, and discomfort brought consequences. Silence became his own strategy. The mistress lived with the secret as one lives with an ache that must not be acknowledged. It surfaced unexpectedly in moments of resemblance, in flashes of recognition she quickly suppressed. She reminded herself of the rules that governed her world, rules she had not written, but benefited from. The child existed within those rules, contained by them, explained away by them. The father lived with the secret differently. For him it was a problem of management, not emotion. He had ensured the child's survival without risking exposure. In his mind this was not cruelty but prudence. He believed himself practical, even merciful, for choosing concealment over elimination. That belief allowed him to sleep. Christmas did not create the secret, it merely brought it closer to the surface. The gift was not the beginning of the story but its continuation, a new phase in the long effort to control what could never be undone. The boy's presence in the house was not an accident, it was the result of years of quiet decisions, calculated silences, and choices made in rooms where the child had never been allowed to exist as anything other than a problem to be managed. The birth remained unrecorded, but its consequences shaped everything that followed. It lived on in glances, in rules, in the careful choreography of denial that governed the plantation. It lived on in the boy himself, in the way he was watched, in the way he was placed, in the way his life unfolded within boundaries he did not understand but could never escape. As the secret continued to be carried forward, intact, unspoken, shaping the present as thoroughly as it had shaped the past, the law did not see motherhood, it did not recognize blood, bond, or birth in the way nature. On the plantation, law was not an abstract idea debated in distant halls but a force that shaped daily life with quiet brutality. It decided who belonged to whom, it defined bodies as property and reduced relationships to transaction. Under its authority, a woman could give birth and still have no claim to the life she created. From the moment the child was born, the law had already spoken. His status was fixed before he took his first breath. He followed the condition of his mother, not the identity of his father. That single rule erased any claim she might have held, no matter who had touched her, no matter whose features appeared in the child's face. The law was clear. The child was enslaved. The child was owned. This principle was enforced without apology. It was written into statutes, upheld by courts, preached from pulpits. It was framed as order, as necessity, as the natural arrangement of society. Motherhood, when attached to an enslaved woman, was stripped of its meaning. It became biological function, without authority, creation without control. The mistress understood this law well. It was one of the pillars supporting her life. It protected her reputation and secured her comfort. It allowed her to look at a child who shared her blood and still accept him as property without contradiction. Because the law had already resolved the conflict in her favor, the law told her what to see and what not to see. It trained her conscience. The father relied on the law even more heavily. It gave him cover. It transformed what might have been considered a scandal into a manageable situation. The law did not ask how the child was conceived. It did not concern itself with consent. It asked only who owned the mother. From that answer, everything else followed. For the enslaved woman, the law was an instrument of erasure. It denied her the most basic human claim. She could nurse the child, soothe him, carry him inside her body, and still have no legal relationship to him. If he were taken from her arms, sold, gifted or reassigned, the law would not recognize her loss. Her grief had no standing. This legal structure reshaped emotions as well as actions. Enslaved mothers learned to love carefully, quietly, often at a distance. Attachment was dangerous. The law made it so. Every bond carried the risk of separation enforced by authority. Children could be removed without warning, justified by ownership papers and signatures that never included the mother's name. The boy grew up inside this legal reality without understanding its language, only its effects. He learned early that affection did not equal protection. He sensed that his place in the world was not defined by who cared for him, but by who claimed him. He belonged not to love, but to law. When the mistress accepted him as a gift, she was not violating the law, she was acting within it. The law permitted such exchanges. It encouraged them. It reduced human life to transferable value. The presence of a mother, even one who stood nearby, even one whose body had created the child, held no weight against a document of ownership. The language used to justify this was deliberate. Enslaved women were described as breeders, not mothers. Their children were increase, not family. These words were not accidental. They shaped perception. They made cruelty appear practical. They allowed society to speak of infants in the same breath as livestock without discomfort. Religion was woven into this legal framework, reinforcing it rather than challenging it. Sermons spoke of obedience and order. Scripture was interpreted to support hierarchy. Motherhood, when it existed outside the bounds of whiteness and freedom, was excluded from moral consideration. The law and the church worked together to define whose love mattered. The mistress had been raised inside this system. She had learned to separate emotion from entitlement. If she felt anything stir when she looked at the boy, the law offered immediate correction. It reminded her that he was not hers in the way a son would be. He was hers in the way property was. That distinction mattered. It preserved her place in society. The enslaved woman who gave birth lived with the consequences daily. She watched the child grow from a distance, knowing that any attempt to assert herself as his mother would be meaningless, in the eyes of the law, and dangerous in practice. Her silence was not consent, it was survival shaped by legal reality. Others on the plantation understood this truth intimately. They had seen it repeated across generations. Laws passed down through books, and courts became lived experience. Through loss, children taken, families fractured, mothers forced to endure what could not be protested. The boy's life unfolded under this authority. His tasks, his movements, his future were all determined by people who had legal standing over him. The woman who had carried him did not. The woman who resembled him did. Law had decided which connection mattered. Even kindness, when it appeared, was shaped by ownership. Any comfort offered to the boy was framed as generosity, not obligation. His well-being depended on mood, on convenience, on utility. The law did not require love, it required control. The cruelty of this system lay not only in its violence, but in its normalization. It taught people to accept the unacceptable as routine. A mother could watch her child serve another woman, and be told this was natural. A child could feel a bond he was not allowed to know. As the Civil War approached, debates about law intensified beyond the plantation gates. Men argued over states' rights, property economics. Rarely did they argue over motherhood. Rarely did they speak of the women whose children were claimed by statutes, written by men who would never bear such losses. The law continued to operate with cold precision. It did not pause for holidays. It did not soften for resemblance. It did not bend for blood. On Christmas morning, when the boy stood in the parlor as a gift, the law stood there with him, invisible but absolute, affirming that this arrangement was not only allowed but protected. The mistress did not have to justify herself. The law had already done that work. She did not have to confront the contradiction between motherhood and ownership. The law had resolved it by erasing one and elevating the other. For the boy, the law was an unseen hand shaping his world. It explained why his life could be given away. It explained why some people could claim him and others could not. It explained why the woman who had birthed him could not call him her son in any way that mattered. And so the system continued, sustained by ink and silence, by rules that turned love into liability and biology into property, by laws that did not recognize mothers, unless they were free, did not recognize.
Silence was not accidental on the plantation. It was cultivated and forced and rewarded. From the highest room in the big house to the lowest cabin at the edge of the fields, everyone understood that certain truths were dangerous not because they were unknown, but because they were known too well. Silence was the shield that protected reputation and power, and it demanded constant participation. The mistress had learned this lesson early in life. Silence was a form of refinement, a mark of breeding. One did not speak of what threatened order. One did not ask questions that disrupted comfort. Discretion was praised as virtue, restraint mistaken for morality. By the time she reached adulthood, silence had become instinct, a reflex as natural as breathing. When the boy entered her household, silence closed around him immediately. No explanations were offered, no origins discussed. If someone noticed the resemblance, they noticed it privately. If a thought formed, it died unspoken. The power of the household depended on this shared restraint. To speak would have been to challenge not only the mistress, but the system that placed her above question. Her husband relied on silence even more deliberately. His authority rested on the appearance of control. Any crack in that appearance threatened everything: his standing among neighbors, his credibility, his dominance within his own home. Silence allowed him to move forward without reckoning, to reshape reality through omission rather than confession. Orders were rarely explicit. They did not need to be. A look, a pause, a shift in tone was enough. Servants learned quickly what topics ended employment, what glances invited punishment, what questions were never asked twice. Silence was safer than truth, and safety was survival. Within the quarters, silence took a different form. It was heavier, born not of privilege but of fear. People knew the cost of speaking out of turn. Stories were shared in fragments. Warnings passed through gesture rather than language. Mothers taught their children what not to say long before teaching them how to speak. The woman who had given birth to the boy lived inside this enforced quiet. Her grief had no audience. Her claim had no recognition. She carried knowledge that could destroy her if voiced. Silence was the only way to remain alive, to continue existing within the narrow boundaries allowed to her. When she passed the boy in the yard or glimpsed him near the house, her face remained blank. Any sign of connection could be misread. Any slip could be punished. Love itself became dangerous when it could not be hidden. Silence wrapped around her emotions, pressing them inward until they became something she endured rather than expressed. Others noticed. They always did. But noticing did not lead to speaking. It led to caution. The plantation survived on this collective discipline, on the understanding that power was protected not by force alone, but by agreement. Silence was the agreement. In the big house, guests participated willingly. They understood the rules even if they were never spoken aloud. A raised eyebrow, a change of subject, a polite laugh. These were the tools of preservation. To question the origins of an enslaved child would have been impolite. Impoliteness was a greater offense than injustice. The mistress's reputation was a fragile construction, maintained through constant performance. She was expected to embody virtue, restraint, moral order. Silence supported that image. It allowed her to exist without contradiction, to receive admiration without scrutiny. The truth, if spoken, would have undone years of careful cultivation. Religion played its part. Sermons praised discretion. Confession was framed as private, never public. Sin could be managed quietly, redeemed silently, erased through proper conduct. Silence became spiritual discipline, a way of aligning oneself with righteousness without confronting harm. The boy sensed this environment without understanding its structure. He learned quickly that speaking drew attention, and attention was dangerous. He learned to answer only when spoken to keep his observations to himself. Curiosity faded under correction. Silence shaped his personality as much as hunger or labor. He noticed how conversations shifted when he entered a room, how laughter softened, how voices lowered. He felt the pressure to be unobtrusive, to occupy space without claiming it. Silence was not demanded outright. It was modeled, reinforced, expected. Power thrived in this quiet. The absence of challenge allowed authority to feel natural, inevitable. Silence erased alternative. It made injustice seem like order. By removing language, it removed the possibility of resistance. Even those who held power were trapped by it. The mistress could not speak the truth even if she wanted to. Her silence protected her, but it also confined her. She lived within a role that required constant denial. Any admission would have threatened not only her position but her identity. The husband's silence was calculated, but it also revealed fear. Fear of exposure, fear of judgment, fear that words might unravel what force alone could not secure. Silence allowed him to believe he was in control, even when the truth lingered close enough to be seen. On the plantation, silence was passed down like inheritance. Children learned it early. They watched adults navigate danger through avoidance, survival through quiet. They absorbed the lesson that speaking truth was not courageous, but foolish. The enslaved community carried stories forward through memory rather than speech. History lived in glances, in warnings, in songs whose meanings were layered and coded. Silence did not erase truth. It buried it where it could survive without detection. The boy became part of this tradition without choosing it. His life unfolded within boundaries defined by what could not be said. He did not know the full reason, only the effect. Silence shaped his days, his posture, his understanding of himself. In moments of stillness, when the house slept and voices were absent, the weight of silence pressed hardest. It filled rooms more completely than sound ever could. It protected those who benefited from it, and crushed those who did not. Reputation and power rested comfortably within this quiet, unchallenged, polished, intact. The cost was borne elsewhere, in withheld words, in swallowed truths, in lives shaped by what could never be acknowledged. The silence continued its work, steady and unquestioned, holding everything in place. The father's involvement was never spoken of openly, yet it shaped every decision that followed. His presence hovered over the boy's life like an unseen hand, guiding outcomes while avoiding accountability. On the surface, he appeared generous, composed, even benevolent. Beneath that surface lay calculation, a careful orchestration designed to protect his authority while managing the consequences of his actions. He had known from the beginning what the child represented. The resemblance did not surprise him. It had been visible early, long before the boy could walk, long before Christmas made the truth harder to ignore. Where others might have panicked, he assessed. Panic solved nothing, control did. His first concern was not the child's well-being but exposure. Reputation was currency in his world. Land, wealth, and influence could be undone by scandal. He understood how quickly whispers traveled among neighboring plantations, how easily a single story could erode carefully built respect. The child was not a moral problem to him. He was a logistical one. The arrangement began quietly. Instructions were given without explanation. Certain people were moved, certain duties reassigned. He ensured the woman who had given birth remained under watch, not through overt cruelty but through restriction. Freedom of movement was narrow. Opportunities to speak were reduced. Silence was enforced through structure rather than threat. He convinced himself this was restraint, that harsher men would have chosen differently, that disappearance, or sale would have been simpler. In allowing the child to live, to grow, to remain on the plantation, he framed himself as merciful. This self-justification mattered. It allowed him to maintain an image of himself as reasonable, even kind. As the boy grew, the father monitored from a distance. He watched how features formed, how behavior developed. He noted who noticed. He adjusted proximity accordingly. The boy was kept just far enough from the big house to avoid constant comparison, yet close enough to remain under control. Distance, he believed, could dilute resemblance. Christmas accelerated the need for action. The boy was no longer a child who blended easily into the crowd. He was becoming visible. Visibility invited questions. Questions invited danger. The solution required decisiveness wrapped in normalcy. The gift was his idea, not presented as strategy but as generosity. By giving the boy to the mistress, he repositioned the problem. Ownership transferred, but control remained. Within her household, the boy could be supervised more closely. His movements could be directed. His narrative could be shaped. The act also reinforced the father's authority. He demonstrated his power to give life as property, to rearrange human beings according to his needs. It was a reminder, subtle but unmistakable, of who decided outcomes on the plantation. He did not consider how the gift would affect the mistress emotionally. If it did at all, her feelings were secondary to order. If she experienced discomfort, she would manage it. She always had. Her role required composure. He trusted her to maintain silence as effectively as he did. In arranging the gift, he chose timing carefully. Christmas offered cover. Generosity was expected. Gifts of all kinds were exchanged. The unusual could be disguised as tradition. Anyone who felt unease would attribute it to the season's excess rather than the act itself. He rehearsed his part well. Calm voice, casual delivery, no hesitation. Authority depended on confidence. If he treated the exchange as ordinary, others would follow. People often took cues from those in power, shaping their reactions accordingly. He watched the room as the boy was presented. He noticed glances, shifts, brief moments of tension. He catalogued these reactions, noting who might become a problem later. Those who looked away quickly were safe. Those who lingered would need watching. The father believed in order above all else. Order justified cruelty when necessary. It allowed him to frame himself as protector of stability rather than source of harm. In his mind, chaos was the real enemy, and anything done to prevent it was acceptable. He never acknowledged the boy as his son, even privately. That language carried responsibility he did not want. Instead, he thought in terms of outcomes, risks, arrangements. Emotional distance was a tool. It kept guilt manageable, conscience quiet. At night, when the house settled and voices faded, the father sometimes thought about contingency. What if the war reached them? What if records were lost? What if power shifted? These thoughts did not lead him to reconsider his actions, only to reinforce the need for control while he still had it. He trusted the law to protect him. The law had always done so. It erased inconvenient truths, and elevated his rights above others. As long as the child remained enslaved, the father's position was secure. The law did not require him to answer for anything beyond ownership. The enslaved community understood his role even if they never named it. They recognized patterns. They knew how such children came to be. They knew who benefited. Their silence was not ignorance. It was forced complicity. The boy himself sensed something about the man, though he could not define it. He noticed the way the father's eyes lingered longer than others, the way commands were issued indirectly but carried weight. He felt a tension he did not understand, an awareness that this man mattered in ways beyond ordinary authority. The father maintained distance. Too much proximity invited recognition. Too much avoidance invited suspicion. He balanced carefully, appearing neither indifferent nor invested. Control required precision. In his mind, the situation was resolved. The boy had a place. The household retained order. The risk of exposure was minimized. He moved forward, satisfied with his solution. What he never considered was the cost beyond his own comfort. The emotional toll on the woman who gave birth. The identity shaped by silence and ownership. The life narrowed by decisions made without consent. These were not factors in his calculations. Power allowed him to believe the matter closed. The gift had been given. The problem managed. The narrative secured. He returned his attention to land,
to war to business, trusting that the system he relied on would continue to hold, unaware, or unconcerned, that every arrangement built on silence carried within it the weight of what had been denied, shaping futures he would never have to face. The boy's existence within the household shifted the rhythm of daily life, even if subtly at first. He moved through the rooms carefully, aware that every step, every glance, every breath was being measured. The mistress's eyes followed him more than necessary, her expectations invisible but constant, shaping his posture, his expression, his very presence. He learned quickly that to exist here was to be scrutinized, compared, cataloged. Every small motion mattered, every hesitation could attract attention he did not want. He carried with him attention that had nothing to do with age or temperament. The boy understood instinctively that he was a gift, but also that a gift carried obligations beyond his comprehension. He must be pleasing without question, obedient without hesitation, quiet without complaint. There was no room for individuality in this performance. The rules of the household demanded assimilation, compliance, invisibility with invisibility. The mistress observed him with a complex gaze, one that balanced ownership with an unconscious recognition she would not admit, even to herself. She noted his features, the small resemblance that seemed to echo her own, and immediately suppressed any reflection it prompted. Recognition was dangerous. It was destabilizing. It could unravel the order that she had always known and relied upon. So she maintained composure, cultivating a mask of calm that spoke of possession, not contemplation. His hands, small but capable, became instruments of service. Tasks were assigned carefully, each core measured to test obedience, attention and adaptability. He moved quickly to respond, learning to anticipate without being told, learning to read subtle cues. Each success was noted silently, each failure corrected quietly but firmly. Through this meticulous orchestration, he became both present and invisible, a paradox that the household navigated instinctively. The presence of the boy also altered the behavior of others in the house. Servants who had previously moved with autonomy adjusted their steps to accommodate. They noted the unspoken rules that surrounded his proximity to the mistress, the careful distance that others were required to maintain. Authority, once unquestioned, was now layered with subtle hierarchy. The boy's placement signaled both privilege and restriction, a constant reminder of the unspoken social codes that governed life in the big house. Guests noticed the boy without fully recognizing why. There were glances exchanged, brief pauses in conversation, a subtle stiffening of posture when he passed. They interpreted it as decorum or proper respect, unaware of the deeper tensions that his presence provoked. The household had trained itself to contain awareness, to manage attention, to maintain a narrative that preserved comfort and appearances. Every interaction was carefully choreographed to uphold order. Outside the house, the enslaved quarters remained a world apart, yet intimately aware of the boy's new position. Mothers whispered caution to their children, elders exchanged knowing glances, and all understood the implications of the boy's proximity to the mistress. It was a reminder that ownership extended beyond labor, beyond supervision, into the intimate spaces of identity and belonging. Observation became as important as obedience. The boy internalized these lessons early. He learned to gauge reactions, to measure attention, to anticipate expectation. He moved quietly, spoke sparingly, and always adjusted posture to convey the subtlest deference. In learning these survival skills, he became attuned to the invisible currents that dictated life in the household. Every glance, every tone, every hesitation could shift perception, and perception could determine treatment. The mistress reinforced these lessons through proximity and instruction. Small gestures, a corrected posture, a softened voice, a pointed look shaped behavior without requiring explicit explanation. Her touch, though brief and calculated, communicated boundaries, expectations, and authority. The boy understood obedience as both necessity and ritual, a way of navigating spaces where attention carried weight far beyond mere observation. The holidays, and Christmas in particular, intensified these dynamics. The boy's presence as a gift symbolized more than obedience. It symbolized compliance with social expectation. Those in the room, from guests to family, understood the underlying power of the moment, even if they did not articulate it. He was a living emblem of authority, hierarchy, and the silent rules that structured the household. Within this context, affection or warmth was carefully mediated. The mistress's actions were calculated to reinforce control rather than encourage attachment. Praise, when offered, was subtle, measured, framed as reward for service rather than recognition of individuality. The boy learned quickly that approval was conditional, given not for who he was but for how well he conformed to expectation. The boy's mother, forced into silence, could watch only from afar. Her grief and longing were contained, moderated, turned inward. She observed his movements, noted his posture, silently lamented the distance imposed by ownership. Every glance carried a history, every interaction a reminder of absence and loss. Yet she could do nothing. Expression was dangerous. Resistance was fatal. The law, society and custom all demanded compliance. Over time the boy became a fixture within the household, both present and unseen. His labor, his attention, his obedience, and his very presence were integrated into daily routines. Servants adjusted their movements. Guests observed etiquette. The mistress maintained authority. Everything functioned according to an unspoken script, meticulously rehearsed and enforced. Despite the efficiency of these routines, tension persisted. Resemblance and history were never fully suppressed. Moments of recognition, fleeting glances, the echo of familiar gestures, all reminded the household of a truth too dangerous to name. These reminders existed quietly, like shadows cast by the firelight, present but intangible, shaping perception without acknowledgement. The boy's understanding of the world was formed entirely within these boundaries. He learned to navigate power with caution, to anticipate needs, to suppress instinctual reactions that could draw attention. Identity was both internal and external, molded by survival, observation and the constant need for compliance. Every aspect of his life was framed by unspoken rules that he absorbed before he could articulate them. In this environment, memory and history intertwined with obedience. The boy's presence reminded all who saw him of events that were never spoken aloud. He embodied inheritance, secrecy and the consequences of choices made long before his birth. His life was both a product of, and a testament to the systems that governed the plantation, reinforcing hierarchies, authority and silence. Even as he matured, the dynamics of visibility and control persisted. The mistress maintained oversight, guests adhered to protocol, and servants navigated expectations with precision. The boy's movements, attention and obedience continued to influence interactions, shaping both his own behavior and the rhythm of the household. Every action carried consequence, every glance held meaning, every pause was calculated. Through these lessons he learned the subtleties of survival within a system that demanded both presence and invisibility. His understanding of authority, hierarchy and self-preservation became intuitive, developed not through explicit teaching but through lived experience, observation and careful adaptation. The household continued to function with apparent normalcy. Rituals, meals, conversation and labor proceeded according to plan. Yet beneath this surface, tension, observation and silent acknowledgement shaped every interaction. The boy existed at the intersection of these forces, a reminder of both human connection and the constraints imposed by ownership. He learned that his existence could be both instrumental and dangerous, that attention could carry power and threat simultaneously, that every act of obedience was both survival and performance. His life became a continuous negotiation of visibility, identity and expectation, defined by rules he could not change, boundaries he could not cross, and authority he was compelled to recognize.
The boy's integration into the household was more than a simple act of obedience. It was a careful orchestration of roles, expectations, and perceptions that defined every interaction he had with those around him. From the moment he was formally received, his life was framed by a rigid set of rules, not written but enforced through observation, subtle gestures, and the constant presence of authority. Every step he took, every word he uttered, every glance he offered was scrutinized, catalogued, and evaluated, shaping the contours of his daily existence. He learned quickly that proximity to the mistress carried both privilege and danger. Being near her offered protection from some forms of punishment, access to certain privileges, and recognition that others in the household did not receive. Yet this closeness also brought an unrelenting pressure to perform, to anticipate needs, to maintain composure at all times. Missteps were magnified, small errors noted, and any display of independent thought or curiosity curtailed immediately through subtle correction or instruction. The mistress herself embodied the balance of authority and careful control. She understood that her position required not only ownership but mastery over perception. She maintained composure, spoke calmly, and moved deliberately, all while reinforcing the invisible boundaries that defined the boy's behavior. Her attention was precise, her expectations consistent, yet her observation never allowed recognition to surface. The resemblance between herself and the boy remained unacknowledged, contained within a private awareness she could neither speak nor fully dismiss. Within this framework, the boy became attuned to the unspoken language of the household. He learned to read the expressions of servants, the subtle inflections in voices, the weight of silences. Each interaction was an opportunity to gauge mood, anticipate need, and avoid attention that might be deemed inappropriate. Over time, these lessons became internalized, forming a behavioral code that guided him even when supervision was minimal. The household itself functioned as a complex ecosystem of control and observation. Servants adjusted their movements to accommodate his presence, noting the invisible hierarchy that positioned him closer to authority than most. Guests followed unwritten protocols, treating him with the respect expected of someone under the mistress's patronage without fully understanding why. These dynamics reinforced the social order, making his role both visible and constrained, emblematic of power while simultaneously confined by it. His mother, separated from him by law and circumstance, remained a silent observer. She understood the necessity of invisibility, the danger of acknowledgement, and the impossibility of asserting her claim. Every glance she stole, every moment she observed from afar, carried a mixture of grief, longing, and caution. Her own survival depended on restraint, and her silence was a measure of both love and necessity. The boy's father operated from a similar calculus. Though framed by authority rather than vulnerability, he managed the logistics of the household, the placement of the boy and the maintenance of appearances with precision. His decisions were guided by control, risk management, and preservation of reputation. Emotional attachment was secondary. The primary concern was containment, ensuring that the boy's resemblance and presence did not destabilize the carefully constructed hierarchy of the plantation. Education, training, and labor were all instrumentalized to reinforce compliance. The boy's daily routines were structured to limit opportunity for reflection or independence. Chores were assigned with intent, each task reinforcing skills, obedience, and awareness of boundary. Instructions were delivered calmly but firmly, shaping behavior through repetition and observation, rather than harsh punishment. This method created a disciplined, attentive presence that satisfied authority while suppressing self-expression. Observation extended to every aspect of his life. The mistress noted posture, responsiveness, and attentiveness. Servants noted alignment with household norms. Guests interpreted manners and composure as indicators of proper training and oversight. Each person in the environment contributed to the boy's understanding of his role, shaping his conduct through a network of expectations that left little room for deviation. The psychological impact of this constant observation was profound. The boy learned to moderate emotion, conceal impulse, and anticipate reaction. He became acutely aware that his identity was shaped not only by who he was but by how he was perceived. Survival required a delicate balance, present enough to fulfill duties, invisible enough to avoid scrutiny, compliant enough to satisfy authority while maintaining self-preservation. The household rituals, from meals to daily chores to seasonal celebrations, reinforced these dynamics. Christmas, with its gifts, gatherings, and formalities, became a stage upon which his role was both symbolized and enforced. The act of being presented as a gift, receiving attention while remaining constrained, taught lessons about visibility, ownership, and hierarchy. Social expectations were intertwined with personal conduct, each reinforcing the other. The mistress's reinforcement of boundaries was both direct and indirect. Corrective gestures, tone shifts, and subtle touches communicated expectations without explicit instruction. Praise, when offered, was selective and calculated, rewarding compliance and discouraging hesitation or defiance. The boy internalized these cues, developing an understanding of social negotiation, authority, and survival within the structures imposed upon him. The broader enslaved community observed and adapted as well. They recognized patterns, shared stories through coded language, and passed lessons down to younger generations. Awareness of hierarchy, obedience, and discretion was part of survival. The boy's presence reinforced these patterns, demonstrating how proximity to authority could be both protective and restrictive. As he grew, the boy's understanding of self and environment became increasingly complex. He learned that power was not solely about possession but also perception, that authority could be exercised quietly and enforced invisibly, and that identity was both personal and socially mediated. He understood that his resemblance to the mistress was a factor in his treatment, yet unspoken, a presence that influenced behavior without naming. The psychological landscape of the household was layered. Authority, obedience, surveillance, and social expectation created a web that governed every interaction. The boy's role was defined within this web, shaped by observation, instruction, and the silent acknowledgement of resemblance. Each moment reinforced the lessons of control, hierarchy, and survival, making him both a participant and a symbol within the complex dynamics of the plantation. Even as he adapted, the underlying tension persisted. The resemblance, the unspoken history, and the rules of conduct created an undercurrent that shaped consciousness and behavior. He learned to navigate these forces intuitively, balancing visibility with restraint, obedience with awareness, presence with caution. Every action carried consequence, every glance held meaning, every pause was measured against expectation. In this way, the boy's life unfolded as a continuous negotiation between authority and survival. The household maintained order through rituals, observation, and subtle reinforcement. Silence was maintained, boundaries enforced, and hierarchy preserved. The boy's presence exemplified these dynamics, demonstrating both the efficiency of control and the weight of constraint. Through experience, he developed skills that were essential to navigation within the household: observation, anticipation, restraint, and performance. Every interaction, whether with the mistress, servants, or guests, reinforced these abilities. His understanding of power, hierarchy, and social expectation became deeply internalized, shaping behavior long before conscious thought could articulate it. By integrating him into the household, the family ensured that he would embody both obedience and the complex lessons of survival. He became an instrument of order, a symbol of hierarchy, and a participant in a carefully maintained system of control. Every action, every instruction, and every observation contributed to this outcome, reinforcing the invisible structures that governed the lives of all within the household. The boy's presence was both functional and symbolic. Functionally, he fulfilled duties, responded to instruction, and participated in the daily operations of the household. Symbolically, he embodied the authority of ownership, the continuity of hierarchy, and the unspoken rules that structured behavior. Through these dual roles, his life was shaped by forces beyond his comprehension, teaching lessons of obedience, restraint, and adaptation that would define his existence for years to come. As the patterns of authority and survival continued to unfold around him, the story reaches its most haunting intensity in the silent, inescapable truth. The boy, a living reminder of blood, love, and law, exists at the intersection of family and ownership, of identity and control. Every glance exchanged, every gesture unspoken, carries the weight of what cannot be acknowledged aloud. The mistress, bound by law and society, cannot claim him as her son, and the boy, confined by the same rules, cannot claim the life that is his by birthright. Their connection is undeniable, yet invisible, a secret carried in every subtle movement, in every resemblance, in every shadowed corner of the household. In that tension lies the true power of the story. It is not just about slavery, gifts, or family. It is about the human cost of systems that reduce love to property and erase the most intimate bonds for the sake of control. The boy's life, the mistress's restraint, the mother's silence, they are all shaped by forces far larger than themselves, yet intensely personal in impact. Each moment is a testament to endurance, to the quiet daily negotiations of survival, to the resilience of the human spirit under impossible conditions. Ultimately, the ending is not about resolution, but reflection. It is about understanding the invisible chains that govern lives, the truths that are carried without acknowledgement, and the echoes of identity and family that persist even when denied. The story lingers in the mind, a reminder that blood, love, and humanity cannot be fully contained, even under the weight of law and custom. It forces us to confront the moral complexities, the heartbreak, and the resilience that defined lives caught between affection and ownership, secrecy and recognition, presence